So, let's start with a simple question. What is a biofuel? And I want to open it with a scene. Close your eyes for just 1 second, if you want. Imagine it is the year 2050. You are maybe 40 years old, and the last drops of cheap, easy oil are gone. Your car, the truck that brings food to your supermarket, the plane that takes you home for the holidays. What fuels them? That is not science fiction. That is a real question that engineers and policymakers and farmers are thinking about right now. So here is the definition I want you to take home with you. A biofuel is any fuel made from renewable organic matter. Plants, algae, agricultural waste, even the food scraps you throw out. The key word is renewable, not fossil, not something we dig out of the ground that took millions of years to form. Something we can grow again next season. The logic has 3 beats, and this is the story arc for the whole hour. 1. The problem. Fossil fuels are finite, and burning them is cooking the planet, and they tie countries into uncomfortable political dependencies. You all know this story. 2. Nature's answer. And this is the beautiful part. Every day, plants and algae and tiny microbes are already doing the work. They take sunlight, water, and CO2, and they pack energy into sugars, starches, and oils for free. Photosynthesis is running at industrial scale across the whole planet, whether we harvest it or not. 3. The idea. The idea of biofuels is this. Can we take that stored solar energy and turn it into a fuel we can actually pour into an engine we already own? Because if we have to replace every car, every ship, every plane, that is a 50-year project. But if we can make a liquid that fits into the existing tank, we can start tomorrow. That is the whole pitch. Keep those 3 beats in mind, because everything else in this talk is going to build on them. So if that is what a biofuel is, the next question is the one any good scientist should ask. Why bother? We already have fuel. Why invent a whole new category? There are 3 answers, and these are the 3 reasons researchers and governments around the world are putting serious money into biofuels. The first one is renewable. Fossil oil took something like 300 million years to form. That is not a resource. That is an inheritance. We are spending it. Biomass, on the other hand, regrows every single year. Plant it in spring, harvest it in autumn, do it again next year. That is the difference. The second is lower greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I want to be careful here because this is where the story gets nuanced, and you will see that nuance later in the talk. Burning a biofuel does release CO2. Of course it does. It is a fuel. But there is a crucial difference. The carbon in biofuels is what we call biogenic carbon. It was in the atmosphere last year. A plant pulled it down via photosynthesis. Now we burn it, and it goes back. It is a short loop. Fossil carbon, on the other hand, has been locked underground for millions of years, and when we burn it, we are adding brand new CO2 to the active cycle. That is the difference. Biofuels are not zero emission, but they are much closer to a closed loop. Third, and this is the pragmatic one that I personally love, they are compatible. You can take ethanol, mix it with gasoline, and pour it into the same car you already drive. You can take biodiesel, mix it with regular diesel, and the truck does not know the difference. We do not need to scrap our entire transportation infrastructure. We can transition gradually, 1 tank at a time. So those are the 3 pillars: renewable, lower emissions, compatible. Remember them, because every generation of biofuel we are going to talk about is trying to deliver on those 3 promises, and some do it better than others. Before we start dividing biofuels into generations and types, I want to give you a mental map. Because if you understand the journey, everything else will make sense. Every single biofuel, no matter how simple or how fancy, walks the same 4 steps. from a field somewhere in the world all the way to the tank of a car or a plane. Step 1. Feedstock. This is the raw material. It could be corn from Iowa. It could be sugarcane from Brazil. It could be wood chips from a Swedish forest. It could be algae grown in a pond. It could even be your leftover cooking oil. Anything that holds biological energy counts. Step 2. Conversion. This is where the magic happens. We need to turn that raw biomass into something that looks and acts like a fuel. And we do this in different ways. Sometimes we use biology. We let yeast or bacteria eat the sugar and produce ethanol, exactly the same way that beer and wine are made. Sometimes we use chemistry. We react oils with alcohol to make biodiesel. Sometimes we use heat. We cook the biomass at high temperatures to break it down into oil and gas. Different feedstocks need different conversions. Step 3. Separation. After conversion, the fuel is mixed with a lot of other things. Water, leftover biomass, impurities. We need to pull out just the fuel part. This is usually done with distillation, the same technique you might have seen in a chemistry class, or with fancier membrane technologies. Step 4. Blending. Finally, we mix our pure BioPure with additives to make sure it matches what a real car engine expects. For example, ethanol gets blended with gasoline to make what we call E10, 10% ethanol, which you can already buy at most gas stations in Europe. Feedstock, conversion, separation, blending. 4 steps. Every biofuel does them. Some do step 2 with bacteria, some do it with heat, but the skeleton is the same. Keep this picture in your head for the rest of the talk. All right, now that you have the 4-step map in your head, let me introduce you to the biofuel family. There are 6 members you should know by name, and you do not need to memorize them. I just want you to recognize them next time you see them in the news. Bioethanol. This is the most famous one, the one you have probably heard of. Made from sugar and starch by fermentation. If you have ever brewed beer or made wine, you have made bioethanol. The only difference is scale. When you buy gasoline at a pump in most European countries today, it already contains 5 or 10% ethanol. That E5 or E10 label, that is bioethanol. Biodiesel, the truck fuel, made from oils and fats, including used cooking oil from restaurants, through a chemical reaction called transesterification. If you drive a diesel car in Sweden, there is a very good chance you are burning a blend called B7, or sometimes even higher. We will talk about Sweden's numbers at the end, and you will be surprised. Biogas. I love this one because it is the waste hero. You take organic waste, food scraps, manure, sewage, and you put it in a sealed tank without oxygen. Microbes eat it and produce methane and CO2. That is biogas. We are turning garbage into fuel, quite literally. Those 3 are the main characters. The other 3 are the supporting cast. Biobutanol is like ethanol's bigger sibling. More energy, better compatibility with gasoline, but harder to produce. It is an active research area. Biohydrogen is the wild card. Pure hydrogen made from biomass. The exhaust is just water. It is exciting, but still early stage. And biojet fuel, which is probably the most important one for the climate, because aviation is really, really hard to electrify. You cannot put a battery in a 747. So the way we decarbonize flying is sustainable aviation fuel, and that is the bet airlines and governments are making right now. 6 names, 6 characters. We will see most of them again. Okay, you now know what a biofuel is, why we want one, how it is made, and the 6 main products. That is your foundation. The rest of the talk is going to build on that foundation. The first big question I want to answer is this: where does the biomass come from? Because it turns out that this question, which sounds simple, is actually the most important question in the whole field. It determines whether a biofuel is cheap or expensive. It determines whether it helps the climate or hurts it. It determines whether it competes with food or not. It determines whether it is ready for the market today or still in a lab. And because this question is so important, scientists have organized biofuels into 4 groups, which they call generations. First generation, second, third, fourth. And each generation tells a different story. A story of progress, of trade-offs, and of some really hard ethical questions. We are about to meet each generation, one by one. Let's go. Here is the whole family tree on one slide. And I am showing you this now because I want you to see the shape of the story before we zoom in. Read the top row. First generation, second, third, fourth. From left to right, the technology gets newer, more sophisticated, and in principle, better for the planet. Now read the feedstock row. First generation uses food crops, things like corn and sugarcane. Second generation uses non-food biomass, basically waste and residues. Third generation uses algae, and fourth generation uses engineered cells that we have designed in the lab. Now look at the bottom row, the carbon impact. First generation has a high carbon content, meaning it still releases a lot of greenhouse gases when you count everything. Second generation is lower. Third generation, carbon neutral. Fourth generation, carbon negative. That means it could actually pull more carbon out of the air than it puts back. Sounds amazing, right? But look at the main problems, though. First generation competes with food. Second generation is hard and expensive to process. Third generation is still expensive. Fourth generation is barely out of the lab and raises ethical questions. So here is the pattern I want you to see. As we move from left to right, the environmental promise gets bigger, but so does the difficulty, and so does the risk. This is the central tension of the whole field. Now, let us zoom in on each generation one at a time, starting with the oldest and most controversial. Let's meet the first generation. These are the original biofuels, the ones that got the whole industry started in the 1970s and 80s. The idea is beautifully simple. You have a crop that is rich in sugar or starch or oil. Corn, sugarcane, soybean, palm oil. You take that crop, you ferment the sugars into ethanol, or you react the oils to make biodiesel. Done. You have a fuel. And on paper, this looks great. The technology is mature, meaning we have been doing it for decades. We already have the farms, the harvesters, the factories. The feedstock is everywhere. It is economically feasible at scale. That is why Brazil runs a huge percentage of its cars on sugarcane ethanol, and the United States has mandated corn ethanol in gasoline for years. But here is where the story gets uncomfortable. Look at the right side of the slide. Number 1, competition with food. Every bushel of corn that goes into a car's gas tank is a bushel of corn that does not feed a person or an animal. In 2007 and 2008, there was a global food crisis, and one of the major culprits was the rapid expansion of biofuels. Food prices went up, poor countries suffered. The link was direct. Number 2, land and water pressure. Growing sugarcane in Brazil to make ethanol sounds green, but where does that sugarcane go? Some of it has gone into what used to be the Amazon, deforestation to grow fuel crops. That is a terrible climate trade. Number 3, the ethical question. This is the one I want you to really sit with. How ethical is it to burn corn and soy as fuel when people in the world go hungry? There is no clean answer. It is a real dilemma. And number 4, the carbon reality check. Even when everything is done well, corn ethanol releases about 82 grams of CO2 per megajoule over its life cycle. Sugarcane is a bit better at 60. Gasoline is around 94. So yes, first-generation biofuels are somewhat better than fossil fuels, but they are not a solution to climate change on their own. They are a first step. First generation opened the door. Now let us see what came next. Let me show you the numbers, because numbers tell a story that words cannot. On the left, you see greenhouse gas emissions for 4 first-generation feedstocks. Corn is the worst at 82. Soybean almost as bad at 78. Sugarcane is better at 60. and palm oil is way down at 20. If you just looked at this chart, you would say, easy, let's grow palm oil everywhere. But now look at the right chart, production cost per liter. Sugarcane is the cheapest at 45 cents. Corn is 70 cents. Palm oil is 60. Soybean is the most expensive. So sugarcane wins on cost, and palm oil seems to win on emissions. Should we just grow palm oil? Here is the catch, and this is why I love this slide. The chart on the left only shows the direct emissions from making the fuel. It does not show what happens when a company clears a rainforest in Indonesia or Malaysia to plant a palm oil plantation. When you cut down a forest, all the carbon stored in those trees goes into the atmosphere, and suddenly that 20 becomes much, much higher. In some cases, palm oil ends up worse than fossil diesel. This is what we call indirect land use change, or ILUC, and it is one of the most contested topics in the biofuel world. A number that looks good on paper can hide a disaster in the forest. The lesson here is that a single number never tells the whole story. You need to know what is inside the number, what was counted, what was left out. This is why life cycle assessment, which I will mention again later, is so important. Okay, first generation is the complicated child. Let us meet the second generation. Second-generation biofuels are the fix to the food versus fuel problem. Instead of using the grain, let's use the parts of the plant we throw away anyway. The straw, the stalks, the husks, the wood chips that pile up at a sawmill, the organic trash that goes in your bin. This sounds perfect, right? You are not stealing food from anyone. You're actually reducing waste at the same time. It is a double win. And the numbers back it up. When you make biofuel from residues, greenhouse gas reductions compared to fossil fuels can reach up to 80%. That is a real climate impact. So why is not all of our biofuel second generation already? Why are we still burning corn ethanol? Here is the catch. Look at the right side of the slide. The biomass fights back. Straw and wood and corn stalks are made of something called lignocellulose. And lignocellulose is tough. It is literally designed by evolution to resist being broken down because plants do not want to be eaten. So before we can ferment the sugars inside, we first have to break through the plant's armor. This is called pretreatment, and it is expensive. Then we have to use enzymes, specialized proteins, to chop the cellulose into sugars. And those enzymes are also expensive. In fact, the enzyme cost alone can be 20 to 30% of your total production cost. That is a lot. Then there is logistics. Corn is concentrated in huge silos on big farms. But straw? Straw is spread across thousands of small fields. Collecting it, transporting it, storing it, that is a nightmare. So second generation is a wonderful idea, but it is caught in a cost trap. The European Union and the United States have set goals to produce more than 1 billion tons of lignocellulosic biofuel per year. We are not there yet. We are getting closer, but the economics still do not work out without subsidies. The biology is not the problem here. The economics is. Remember that, because it comes back later. Next, we jump into the water, because our next character lives in a pond. So we had first generation from crops, second generation from waste. Third generation takes a completely different direction. It says, forget plants. Let's use algae. Now, when I say algae, I do not mean seaweed, although some projects use that too. Mostly, I mean microalgae. Tiny, single-celled organisms. Green, floating in water, photosynthesizing like mad. And these little guys have some remarkable properties. Look at the first column. Why algae? They grow incredibly fast. Some species can double their biomass in 24 hours. A corn plant takes a whole season. They can be up to 80% lipid by dry weight, 80% oil. There is no land crop on Earth that even comes close. Soybeans are maybe 20% oil. Algae blow them away. They do not need farmland. They grow in saltwater, brackish water, even wastewater. You can literally feed them sewage and they will turn it into biofuel feedstock while cleaning the water. They absorb carbon dioxide at up to 5 times the rate of land crops, which means they can be coupled to industrial flue gas to pull CO2 straight out of smokestacks. And from one batch of algae, you can make multiple different biofuels: biodiesel, ethanol, biogas, even hydrocarbons that look a lot like jet fuel. Sounds perfect, right? So why are we not all driving algae cars? Look at the third column, the catch. It is expensive. Growing algae in open ponds works, but you lose a lot of water to evaporation, and the algae can be contaminated by invaders. Growing them in closed photobioreactors works better, but the reactors cost a fortune to build and run. Harvesting is a nightmare. The algae are microscopic, and they are mostly water. Imagine trying to collect a teaspoon of green dust from a swimming pool, and then drying them, extracting the oil, processing it. Every step eats energy. So by the time you have a liter of algal biodiesel in your hand, it has cost you much more than gasoline. Third generation is the most exciting in terms of potential. It is also the one that is stuck in pilot scale. We know it can work. We do not yet know how to make it work cheaply. But researchers are really pushing this. It is one of the hottest areas of bioenergy research right now. And now we arrive at the newest frontier, fourth generation. And this one is really science fiction becoming real. The concept is this: what if, instead of taking whatever biology gives us, we designed biology to give us exactly what we want? What if we could go into the DNA of a microorganism or an alga and edit it so that it produces a fuel with the perfect energy density, the perfect combustion properties, the perfect everything? That is fourth generation. We use synthetic biology, genetic engineering, and tools like CRISPR to build custom microorganisms that are essentially tiny fuel factories. On the left, advantages. You can design fuels that do not exist in nature. You can make organisms that actually absorb more CO2 than they release, which means the fuel is net negative carbon. You can push lipid content higher, growth faster, all of it optimized. In the middle, challenges. This is where it gets hard. There are real environmental risks. What if a genetically modified alga escapes from a bioreactor into the wild and outcompetes native species? What if it causes an algal bloom? We have to be really careful. Most of this work is still in the lab or at pilot scale. The economics are uncertain. R&D costs are enormous. And there are genuine ethical concerns that we need to take seriously. Do we want a world where fuel is grown by custom-designed life forms? On the right, the future. CRISPR, which I assume most of you have heard of by now, lets us edit genomes with surgical precision. Metabolic engineering lets us rewire the internal chemistry of a cell to overproduce whatever we want. And the really exciting application is coupling these engineered organisms to industrial flue gases so that CO2 from a cement factory is pumped into a tank of algae that turns it into fuel. Closed loop. Beautiful in theory. So that is the arc. From a cornfield in Iowa to a custom-designed microbe in a bioreactor in 50 years. That is the journey biofuels have taken. Each generation tried to fix the problems of the previous one, and each one created new questions of its own. Now, let us step inside the factory, because all of this is only possible because of one thing: biotechnology. Okay, so far we have talked about what biofuels are, why we want them, and what kinds exist. That is the geography of the field. Now I want to take you behind the scenes, because when I say fermentation, or enzymes, or genetic engineering, those are not just abstract words. They are actual techniques that people in labs and factories use every day. And I want you to get a real sense of how this stuff works. The next few slides are the engine room of the talk. We're going to look at how biomass is converted, how fermentation actually happens step by step, what role biotechnology plays, and where all these fuels end up being used. When we say conversion, we are really talking about two completely different philosophies, two roads from biomass to fuel. The first road is the biological one, on the left. We use living things, microorganisms, to do the work for us. This is biochemical conversion, and it comes in three flavors. Fermentation.
This is the ancient one. Humans have been fermenting sugars into ethanol for thousands of years to make beer and wine. It is the exact same microbe, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the baker's yeast. We just do it at industrial scale and collect the ethanol instead of drinking it. Anaerobic digestion. This is fermentation's moody cousin. Instead of yeast, we use ancient microbes called methanogenic archaea. Put organic waste in a sealed tank, no oxygen, and these microbes will slowly digest it and produce methane. This is biogas. This is how a dairy farm can turn cow manure into fuel for its tractors. Enzymatic hydrolysis. This is the helper step. Before fermentation can work on something tough like straw, we use enzymes to chop the cellulose into simple sugars. Enzymes are like molecular scissors. They cut big molecules into small ones.
Now, the second road, the right side, thermochemical conversion. Instead of microbes, we use heat and pressure. This is where biology meets brute force chemistry. Pyrolysis. You take biomass, heat it to 400 or 600 degrees in the complete absence of oxygen, and it decomposes into three products. Bio-oil, which is a dark liquid, biochar, which is a solid rich in carbon, and syngas. Think of it as extreme cooking. Gasification. Same idea, but with a little bit of oxygen. You do not get a liquid. You get syngas, which is carbon monoxide plus hydrogen. And here is the cool part. You can take that syngas through a process called Fischer-Tropsch and turn it into synthetic diesel or jet fuel. Hydrothermal liquefaction. This is my favorite. You take wet biomass, like algae. You do not bother drying it. You just throw it into water at 300 degrees and very high pressure, and the water itself acts like a solvent and breaks the biomass down into biocrude. It is ingenious. And finally, combustion, which is the oldest one. You just burn it for heat and electricity. Not fancy, but it works, and it is the backbone of Swedish district heating, as we will see. So whenever you hear about a biofuel, you can ask yourself, is this biochemical or thermochemical? Is biology doing the work, or is heat doing the work? That is the fundamental choice. Let me zoom in on the most important biochemical process, which is fermentation, because this is responsible for bioethanol, which is still the biggest biofuel in the world by volume. 5 steps, from a cornfield to the tank of a car. Step 1, prepare. You take the raw feedstock, corn or sugar cane or straw, and you crush it and cook it and prepare it so that the sugars are released and accessible. If you are working with tough lignocellulose, this step includes pretreatment and enzymatic hydrolysis. Step 2, ferment. This is the core. You add yeast or bacteria into a giant tank with the sugary broth, you keep the temperature and pH just right, and the microbes start eating. They consume the sugar and they excrete ethanol, which is, from their point of view, a waste product. We just happen to find that waste product very useful. Step 3, distill. After fermentation, you have a soup that is maybe 10 to 15% ethanol, mixed with water and dead yeast. You heat it, and because ethanol boils at 78 degrees and water at 100, the ethanol evaporates first. You capture the vapor, cool it back down, and now you have concentrated ethanol. Step 4, purify. Distillation gets you to about 95% pure. The last 5% is really stubborn. Modern plants use membrane technology to finish the job. Step 5, blend. You mix the pure ethanol with additives to meet the engine specs, and then you deliver it to the pump. At the bottom of the slide, I want to give credit to the real workers in this story. The microbes. For ethanol, we mostly use baker's yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is exactly the same species that makes your bread rise. We also use Zymomonas mobilis, a bacterium that is actually more efficient than yeast for some feedstocks. For butanol production, we use Clostridium species. For biogas, we use ancient archaea called methanogens. And for lipid-based biodiesel, we use certain yeasts like Rhodotorula glutinus that store a lot of oil in their cells. These are your invisible workforce. Trillions of tiny cells working 24 hours a day, turning sugar into fuel. I find this genuinely beautiful
Because it means the future of transportation is partly being written by organisms that humans have worked with for thousands of years, just in a new context.
So, what is biotechnology actually doing for the biofuel field? Let me show you 4 concrete levers that are turning this from a nice idea into something economically viable. First lever, engineering microbes. Classical yeast is actually kind of picky. It really likes glucose, and it gets annoyed by xylose, which is another sugar abundant in plant waste. So researchers have gone into yeast genomes and engineered strains that can eat both sugars. That alone improves yields by something like 15%. Other strains have been engineered to tolerate much higher ethanol concentrations, which means less dilution, less distillation, lower costs. And then there are exotic designs, yeast that makes isobutanol instead of ethanol, because isobutanol has more energy and is friendlier to engines. Second lever, better enzymes. Remember the enzyme cost bottleneck from second generation? A lot of research is focused on making enzymes cheaper and more effective. Directed evolution is a technique where you basically run an accelerated version of natural selection on enzymes in a lab. You make random variants, you test them, you keep the winners, you repeat. And it works. One study achieved an 88-fold increase in xylanase activity through this approach. 88-fold. That is not a tweak, that is a revolution.
Third lever, the biorefinery concept. This is an important idea borrowed from the oil industry. A petroleum refinery does not just make gasoline. It makes diesel, jet fuel, lubricants, plastics, fertilizer precursors, everything. A biorefinery does the same thing with biomass. You take corn, and from the same corn, you make ethanol for fuel, plus distiller's grains for cattle feed, plus corn oil for cooking, plus CO2 for fizzy drinks. Suddenly, the economics make sense because you are not selling one product, you are selling 5. Fourth lever, machine learning and AI. This one is relatively new and it is exploding. Biology is complicated. There are hundreds of parameters that affect how well a fermentation runs. Temperature, pH, sugar concentration, microbe strain, aeration, stirring, timing. Traditionally, you optimize these by trial and error. Now we use machine learning to predict the best conditions, and one study got predictions within 0.26% of reality. Deep learning is being used to design photobioreactors for algae. AI is becoming a real tool in the biotech toolbox. These 4 levers are why I am optimistic. The science is not standing still. Every year, these processes get a bit cheaper, a bit faster, a bit smarter, and small improvements compound.
So, where are biofuels actually used today? Not as a lab curiosity, but in the real world. 4 places. You can see them on the cards. Road transport. This is the biggest one. If you have filled up at a gas station in Europe in the past few years, there is a very good chance you bought a biofuel blend without even realizing it. E10 is 10% ethanol. E20 is 20%. B20 is 20% biodiesel in regular diesel. This is happening now at massive scale. Aviation. This is the most interesting one. Airplanes are incredibly hard to electrify. Batteries are just too heavy. So if we want to decarbonize flying, we basically have to use drop-in fuels that look and behave like kerosene but are made from biomass. There are 3 main routes: HEFA from oils, Fischer-Tropsch from syngas, alcohol to jet from ethanol. KLM, Lufthansa, United, all of them have done flights on sustainable aviation fuel blends. Airlines now buy certificates for it. Aviation accounts for about 2% of global CO2, and it is growing. So this matters. Marine. Shipping is also hard to electrify because ships travel huge distances. The International Maritime Organization has a target of cutting shipping emissions in half by 2050. Advanced biofuels will be part of that story, maybe combined with ammonia or hydrogen. Power and heat. This is a whole different world. Instead of liquid fuel for a vehicle, you use solid biomass or biogas to generate electricity and heat in combined heat and power plants. This is enormous in Sweden, as we are about to see, and it is how Swedish cities stay warm in winter. Now, look at the bottom of the slide.
I want you to sit with these numbers for a moment. Global biofuel production in 2022 was 1,914,000 barrels per day of oil equivalent. That is almost 2 million barrels per day. That is a lot. It is still small compared to fossil oil, which is around 100 million barrels per day, but it is not a rounding error anymore. And IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, projects this will grow by a factor of 5 by 2050. The biofuel sector is expected to exceed $200 billion by 2030. So this is not a science experiment. This is an industry. It is already bigger than most people realize, and it is going to get much bigger.
All right. I have spent the first part of this talk selling you on biofuels, telling you how they work, why they matter, and all the clever biotechnology inside. And I believe all of that. But I would be a bad teacher and a worse scientist if I only gave you the good news. Every silver bullet has a shadow, and the biofuel field has some very real shadows. Some of them are technical, some of them are economic, and some of them are deeply ethical. I want to walk you through the 5 biggest challenges, because the honest version of this story has to include them. If you only remember the pretty parts, you will be surprised when you meet someone who is angry about biofuels. And there are plenty of those people, and some of their reasons are legitimate. So let us look at the hard questions.
5 challenges. Let me walk through each one briefly. Number 1, feedstock and cost. Biofuels are only as cheap as the biomass that goes into them, and biomass prices swing wildly. Corn prices in the US have gone from $3.50 a bushel to $5.30 in just a few years. When corn gets expensive, corn ethanol gets expensive. Securing stable, cheap feedstock without harming food supply is really hard. Number 2, land, water, and biodiversity. We touched on this with palm oil and sugarcane. Growing fuel crops uses land and water that could be used for food or left as habitat. Brazilian sugarcane expansion has been associated with Amazon deforestation. Indonesian palm oil has been associated with orangutan habitat loss. The climate benefit of a biofuel can be completely erased if you cut down a forest to grow it. Number 3, the energy and carbon balance. This is the subtle one. A biofuel only helps the climate if you use less fossil energy to make it than you save by using it. If your tractors burn diesel, if your fertilizer is made from natural gas, if you ship the biomass across the country in a truck, all of that adds up.
In the worst cases, a biofuel can end up with almost the same carbon footprint as gasoline. That is why life cycle assessment matters so much. You have to count everything. Number 4, technical barriers. I already talked about pre-treatment and enzyme costs. Second-generation biofuels especially are held back by these. The biology works, but the engineering has not yet caught up. And scaling a process from a 10-liter lab reactor to a 10 million-liter industrial plant is hard. Things that work at small scale break at large scale. Number 5, and this is maybe the most underappreciated one, policy and markets. Biofuels depend heavily on government support. When subsidies change, when the carbon tax changes, when regulations shift, entire companies go bankrupt. When oil prices crash, biofuels suddenly become uncompetitive overnight. COVID-19 raised biomass transportation and handling costs by up to 85%, and the whole supply chain was in chaos. This is not a stable business to be in. These 5 are real. None of them are deal breakers, but all of them have to be managed. The future of biofuels depends on solving these, not on having better microbes alone. It also depends on having smart policy, patient capital, and honest communication with the public. So far, this has all been global. Averages, projections, generalities. I want to end with something concrete, because the best way to understand energy policy is to look at a real country that is actually doing it. And there is no better example than the country we are sitting in right now, Sweden. Sweden is interesting because it is not only a leader in renewables in general, it is specifically a leader in bioenergy. Not solar, not wind, bioenergy. And that is a bit unusual, because when most people think renewables, they think wind turbines and solar panels. Sweden thinks forests.
Over the next few slides, I want to show you what happens when a country actually commits to bioenergy. How much of their energy comes from biomass, where it is used, what they import, what they make themselves, and how their transport sector looks today. All of this data comes from the IEA reports published in 2024. I think you will find some of the numbers surprising. Let us see.
Here is Sweden's energy situation in one picture. 4 big numbers at the top, 4 smaller ones in the middle, and 1 take-home at the bottom. The big number on the left, 1,870 petajoules. That is Sweden's total energy supply. A petajoule is 10 to the 15 joules, roughly the energy in 33 million liters of diesel. So 1,870 pj is about 60 billion liters of diesel equivalent. That is what the whole country needs in 1 year. Now, the second number, 49.3%. Nearly half of Sweden's total energy supply is already renewable. That is extraordinary. Most European countries are still way below 30%. Sweden is at 50. The third number, in green, is the one I really want you to notice. 29% of total energy supply comes from bioenergy alone. Not all renewables, just bioenergy. Which means of that 49% renewable share, the biggest single slice is bioenergy. Not wind, not solar, not even hydropower. Bioenergy. That is unusual globally, and it is very Swedish. It makes sense when you remember that Sweden is 70% forest.
The fourth number, 30% from nuclear, is a reminder that Sweden's low-carbon story has 2 engines. Bioenergy is one of them. Nuclear is the other. Now look at the fossil breakdown in the middle row. Oil products, 20%, coal, 3.3%, natural gas, 1.4%, and non-renewable waste, 2.1%. Add those up, and you get roughly 27% fossil. So Sweden gets almost 3/4 of its energy from non-fossil sources. 3/4. The take-home at the bottom. Renewables at 49, plus nuclear at 30, give Sweden around 80% low-carbon energy. And of the renewables, bioenergy is the biggest slice. That is the context for everything else we are about to see.
Look at this chart for a moment. It is the evolution of Swedish bioenergy from 2010 to 2022. Total rising from about 450 petajoules to 540. That is a 20% growth in 12 years. Not spectacular, but steady. No boom, no bust, just patient accumulation. Now look at the colors. The big green hatched area at the bottom, that is solid biomass. Wood pellets, wood chips, bark, sawdust, everything you can burn directly. And you can see it is the absolute backbone, about 420 petajoules. It is what keeps Swedish industry running and what heats Swedish homes in winter. The yellow band above, biodiesel, is the interesting story. That is growing fastest. Swedish transport policy has pushed hard on biodiesel, especially HVO, which stands for hydro-treated vegetable oil. HVO is a drop-in replacement for regular diesel. You can pour it into any diesel engine and it just works. So Sweden has been blending more and more of it into the diesel supply. Today, about 60 to 70 petajoules. Then you see the red band, biogas.
It is small, only about 8 petajoules, but it grew from 1 petajoule in the early 2000s. That is an 8-fold increase. And this is the fuel that comes from food waste and sewage. Modest in size, but genuinely circular. The thin blue band is bioethanol. And here's something you might not expect. Bioethanol actually peaked in Sweden around 2011 and 2012, and then declined. Why? Because the Swedish policy choice favored diesel blends over gasoline blends, and because electric vehicles started to eat into the gasoline market, which shrinks the space for bioethanol anyway. So ethanol in Sweden is a relatively small story, maybe 7 to 9 petajoules now. The punchline of this slide: Sweden's bioenergy story is not fancy. There are no exotic algae farms here. The big story is burning wood for heat and electricity. Simple, mature, effective. And that accounts for almost 1/3 of all the energy used in the country.
Before we leave the Sweden section, I want to show you one more reason why this country bets on bioenergy. And it is not just about climate. It is about security. Look at the left side, 5 charts from the IEA, Sweden's import dependency on different fuels. The top 3 are oil, coal, and natural gas. Look at the green dashed line, which is import dependency. It is glued to 100%. Sweden does not produce any oil, no coal, no natural gas. They buy all of it from somewhere else. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, much of Europe's natural gas came from Russia. Sweden saw this coming and reduced its gas dependency years ago. But even so, every cubic meter of gas, every barrel of oil, every ton of coal, Sweden imports. Now, look at the 4th chart, import dependency on biofuels and waste. The green dashed line is only around 10 to 20%, meaning Sweden makes most of its own bioenergy, domestically, from its own forests and its own farms. This is a huge strategic advantage. If an international crisis cuts off oil imports, Sweden has a problem. If the international wood pellet market gets disrupted, Sweden can lean on its own supply. Bioenergy is a local fuel in a way that fossil fuels can never be. The 3 stat cards on the right summarize it. 100% fossil fuel dependency, 10% bioenergy dependency, and overall 21% energy import dependency across all sources in 2022. Compare that to a country like Germany, which is something closer to 70% import dependent. This is why bioenergy is not just a climate policy in Sweden, it is also a security policy. It keeps the lights on even when the world gets complicated. That is a message every country in Europe is now paying attention to. Okay, here's a concrete question. When you wake up in a cold Swedish January and your apartment is warm, where does that heat come from? Look at the left chart. It shows fuel and heat consumption in Sweden from 2010 to 2022. Each color is a different fuel source. The biggest green area is direct biomass, meaning wood. The lighter green above it is distributed heat from renewable sources. The dark purple and gray stuff at the bottom is fossil fuels and non-renewable waste. Now, watch what happens over time. The fossil fuels at the bottom are slowly shrinking. The biomass areas are slowly growing. The total stays roughly flat, around 550 petajoules, but the composition shifts toward renewable. On the right side, I have pulled out the 4 key numbers. 46% of fuel and heat comes from direct biomass, and 80% of that is used by industry. The Swedish pulp and paper industry is huge, and it runs largely on its own wood waste. They cannot use the black liquor byproduct for anything else, so they burn it for process heat. This is circular by design. 34% comes from heat sales, which means district heating. District heating is a wonderful Swedish invention. You have a big central plant in the city, it burns biomass or runs on heat pumps, and it pumps hot water through insulated pipes to apartment buildings all over town. Almost every Swedish city has this. One plant heats thousands of homes. 20% is still fossil fuels, but it is shrinking, and it used to be much higher. And the most important number, 74% of distributed heat comes from biomass, 3/4. When you shower in a Lund apartment in winter, the chances are you are using hot water that was warmed by burning wood waste from a forest nearby. That is the Swedish model in one picture. One more Sweden slide, and then I want to open it up to discussion. This is Swedish transport energy from 2010 to 2022, and I love this chart because it tells a story that I think is really encouraging. Look at the gray area at the bottom. That is fossil diesel. It starts big and stays big. Look at the yellow area, which is biodiesel, mostly HVO. It starts tiny in 2010 and grows into a huge slice by 2022. Green is bioethanol, thin and slightly declining, and the little slivers of blue at the bottom are electricity, which is growing but still small. Now, the 4 numbers on the right, 300 petajoules total. Transport in Sweden uses about 300 petajoules per year. It was stable until 2019, then dropped 7% in 2020. Guess what happened in 2020? COVID. People stopped driving. And even in 2022, it has not fully recovered. 35% biodiesel share of the diesel fuel sold in Sweden. Think about that. Over a third of every diesel tank in a Swedish truck is already biofuel. This is one of the highest shares in the world. It is mostly HVO, hydrotreated vegetable oil. But here is the catch, and I have to be honest.
About 80% of that HVO is imported. Sweden does not grow enough oil crops of its own to supply this. So while the biodiesel is renewable, Sweden is still dependent on imported feedstock, and a lot of that comes from palm oil-adjacent supply chains, which is ethically complicated. This is one of the active debates in Swedish energy policy right now. 8% bioethanol in gasoline. Much smaller than biodiesel, and declining because the gasoline market is shrinking. 5.4% electricity. Growing fast, thanks to electric vehicles, and 68% of it is renewable. The big picture. Sweden has largely electrified its electricity system with nuclear and hydro. It has largely biofueled its heat system with wood. The transport system is the last frontier, and it is being tackled with a combination of biodiesel today and electric vehicles for tomorrow. If there is one country to watch on bioenergy policy, this is it.
All right, I have been talking for a long time, and I am sure you are ready to say something. I want to leave you with 4 questions. There are no right answers to these. They are the kinds of questions that honest experts disagree about, and the best answers will come from you thinking out loud, not from me telling you. Question 1. If you were a policymaker in your country, which generation of biofuels would you prioritize, and why? Would you go with first generation because it is cheap and ready, even though it competes with food? Or second generation because it is waste-based but expensive? Or would you pour everything into third and fourth generation research, knowing it will not pay off for a decade? Question 2. For your specific region, think about where you come from. What is the most logical feedstock? If you are from a rice-growing country, maybe rice straw. If you are from a city, maybe municipal organic waste.
If you are from a coastal region, maybe algae. The answer really depends on where you are. Question 3. This is the big one. Can biofuels alone solve the climate and energy problem, or do they need to be combined with solar, wind, hydrogen, and direct electrification? My personal view is that biofuels are one tool in a very big toolbox, and anyone who tells you otherwise is probably selling something. But I am curious what you think. Question 4. The ethical one. The food versus fuel dilemma. Is there a line you would not cross? Would you use 10% of the world's corn for fuel? 20? 50? What about in a country where people are genuinely hungry? This question has no technical answer. It is a values question. Take a few minutes. Talk to the person next to you. I would love to hear at least 1 or 2 responses before we close.
Biofuel equals biomass feedstock plus conversion plus separation plus a real engine. If you remember only one sentence from today, let it be that one. Everything else was detail hanging on those 4 words. 3 things to carry with you. Biofuels are not magic. They are a toolbox, and every tool has its own use and its own limit. Every generation trades something away. First generation is cheap and ready, but competes with food. Second uses waste, but fights expensive biology. Third has astonishing potential, but is stuck at pilot scale. Fourth is thrilling and raises questions we are not done answering. None is perfect, and all of them matter. And the deepest questions in this field were never really about biology. They were about systems. How do you scale it? How do you pay for it? How do you make sure it truly helps the climate once you count everything? And how do you do it fairly? Sweden showed us one honest answer. Forests, district heating, patient policy, and a transport sector still working out its last frontier. So go and build the strategy. Pick a country, pick a feedstock, pick a generation, and be ready to defend it. You already have everything you need. Enjoy the work ahead. Stay curious and stay honest about the trade-offs. Thank you for your time and your attention.